This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the go-to podcast on all things Scottish, and I'm delighted to have you with me for this final episode of a tour around Scotland's largest city, Glasgow, especially on its 850th birthday this year. This podcast is dedicated to Bill Scott, who was kind enough to be recorded and tell us of his experience during his shipbuilding career on Clyde side, spanning some 40 years. Sadly, Bill has now passed away, but his son, Andy Scott, has kindly given permission for the recording to be included in this episode. My last podcast interrupted the flow of my Glasgow series somewhat as I inserted a bonus episode after my very successful visit to New York to take part in the famous Tartan Week. Well, if you've not yet listened, please do. I had an amazing time and I'd love to share with you the highlights of that wonderful city. My previous 3 episodes have focused on touring Glasgow City, and I hope you've enjoyed meandering around the streets with me, listening to the stories behind the rise of Glasgow and the history as it unfolded. This podcast is an addition to the Glasgow series, but instead of meandering the streets, we will meander around the River Clyde, the lifeblood of the city, bringing goods to Scotland's shores via this amazingly busy waterway, which in turn became one of the world's busiest shipyards, with some of the most famous ships in the world being constructed here. I have to say I love New York, but it's good to be back home in Scotland, where it's been quite tropical recently, with the temperatures getting up to about 23 degrees centigrade or 78 degrees Fahrenheit. And I had wee Minnie out for a walk with me this morning, my little spaniel dog, down to Aberlady Bay, and it was mild with a wee bit of drizzly rain. So I'm excited to be bringing this extra episode and telling you how Glasgow's River Clyde was once the beating heart of global shipbuilding. From the early 19th century through to the mid-20th century, the Clyde shipyards produced thousands of vessels that shaped maritime history, earning Glasgow the nickname Second City of the British Empire. Shipbuilding on the Clyde actually dates back to the 15th century, but it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that the region truly flourished, especially with the deepening of the river, which allowed larger ships to be built and launched. Incredibly, by the late 1800s, Clyde shipyards were producing a fifth of the world's ships. As well as telling you about the shipbuilding that took place here, I'll also tell you of some of the stories attached to these amazing ships that were built, such as the Lusitania, which changed the course of world history. To see some photographs of Glasgow shipyards then, and some of the old shipyards as they remain today, then visit my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. And you can also link to my other social media channels through my website, Facebook and also LinkedIn, as well as Instagram, which can be found at exclusive_Scottish_visits. So do look me up. Well, wherever you are in the world, I would now like you to relax and to join me on this 4th and final episode of Glasgow, Shipbuilding on the River Clyde. It cannot be underestimated just what a great part that the River Clyde played in the fortunes not just of Glasgow or Scotland, but the whole of the United Kingdom as well as the British Empire. Glasgow's River Clyde was once renowned worldwide for its shipbuilding industry and was the most important shipbuilding area in the world up until the early part of the 20th century. Between 1711, when the Scott family shipyard was built at Greenock, and the present day, over 25,000 ships have been built on the River Clyde, its firth and its tributaries. Over the same period, it's estimated that more than 200 firms have at any one time been engaged in shipbuilding on Clydeside, with 30 to 40 firms operating at any given time, and upwards of about 100,000 workers building these ships that earned the reputation of Clyde built. Its rise was dramatically fast, as was its subsequent decline, and the reversal of fortunes for the economy and the people of Glasgow, as well as the surrounding area, is still being felt today. So first, let me tell you a little bit about the River Clyde itself and some of the history covering this area. The River Clyde has its source in the Lowther Hills in South Lanarkshire and runs for about 110 miles to its exit into the Firth of Clyde on the west coast of Scotland. It is one of the longest rivers in Scotland alongside the River Tay and the River Spey, and it runs right through the middle of Glasgow. Its name probably comes from the Celtic language Clotta, who was a Celtic goddess whose name meant the strong flowing one or the holy cleanser. We do know that the Romans called it Clotta, and the Britons of the Kingdom of Strathclyde used the name Clud or Clwt. Indeed, the historic Dumbarton Castle, situated on its prominent volcanic plug overlooking the river, was once named Alt Clwt. Humans have settled along the Clyde for thousands of years, and artefacts dating from 12,000 BC have been found near to the river. But coming right up to the 1st or the 2nd century AD, the dominant tribe in the area was the Damnonii, and they formed the Kingdom of Strathclyde. And this was founded as an independent British kingdom, with its core territory located around the Clyde Basin. The kingdom was ruled from its capital, the near impregnable Alt Clwt Fortress, which is Dumbarton Rock, which is situated on the river and overlooks much of the estuary. There's not much left of the fortification, but Dumbarton Castle played its own role in Scottish history with the incarceration of William Wallace just before he was sent to London to be hung, drawn and quartered. It was also from Dumbarton Castle that the young Mary Queen of Scots escaped the clutches of Henry VIII and went to France. In the 7th century, St Mungo established a new Christian community on the banks of the River Clyde, and this community was the beginnings of what we now know as the City of Glasgow, and St Mungo's shrine, who's also known as St Kentigern, can be found in the 12th century Glasgow Cathedral. In terms of the importance of the River Clyde, it has to be remembered that the sea, the lochs, the rivers were the motorways of the past, and the Clyde's always been important commercially as a trade route around Britain and Europe, then becoming a hugely important trade route to America from the early 18th century. In reality, it was this important as a trading post that eventually led to a considerable surge in the building of ships, especially as the raw materials, fuel, power source, manpower and engineering innovation were readily available locally. And what powered this huge change in fortunes for Scotland and the River Clyde owes a great deal to the 1707 Act of Union, when Scotland became co-joined with England to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. For the first time, the colonial trade was opened up to the Scots. Previously, Scottish ships ran the risk of piracy and had no rights to trade with English colonies, but they now came under the protection of the Royal Navy and enjoyed the security afforded by the Navigation Acts, which stipulated that any produce exchanged with British colonies must be carried in British shipping. Thus, Scottish cargo and trading ships came under the umbrella of this monopoly, under the protection of the newly established Royal Navy, when Britannia really did rule the waves. The most important result of this was that it literally heralded a sea change in the direction of trade for Scotland. The American colonies were already an established and lucrative market for English business, and when Scotland became part of the Union, the Scots merchants and entrepreneurs in the Clyde Valley took full advantage. The geographical position of the west coast of Scotland became an absolute godsend, as it offered the shortest trade route to the important markets on the eastern seaboard, such as Maryland and Virginia. Consequently, the merchants of Glasgow commenced a very busy trade in goods such as sugar, tobacco and raw cotton, with the colonies over the Atlantic. An example of the wealth generated is shown in tobacco imports. In 1715, tobacco imports to Scotland amounted to only 11,000 tonnes, but 30 years later, in 1745, this had soared to 60,000 tonnes. The figures continued to grow until the outbreak of the US War of Independence in 1776, when tobacco imports were averaging around 200,000 tonnes a year. The so-called tobacco lords of Glasgow reigned supreme in business. Men like William Cunningham, Alexander Spears, and the wonderfully eccentric John Glassford. And this wealth for the tobacco, sugar and cotton barons built some of the most extraordinary mansions that still exist in Glasgow today. A good example is the Gallery of Modern Art, and if you look at it from the side, you'll see a mansion house in the middle with extensions either side to make up the present-day gallery. This was William Cunningham's townhouse. Yes, he did have a few other properties outside the city. If you can't quite make out the building I'm talking about, you'll know the Duke of Wellington statue on his horse, with a traffic cone on his head, which is a truly iconic image of Glasgow. Well, the building behind that statue is the Gallery of Modern Art and the previous townhouse of William Cunningham. Of course, initially Glasgow merchants such as Cunningham did not possess any suitable ships of their own for the Atlantic trade, and the ships were hired in the early days. However, their sheer wealth made it possible to build their own ships locally, and whereas in 1707, when Scotland became part of Britain, there were only 8 ships built on the Clyde, by 1712 this had risen to 149, a huge increase. The only obstacle to Glasgow's real economic growth was the Clyde was too shallow for the largest ocean-going ships to dock in Glasgow itself, so cargo had to be transferred to smaller ships at Greenock and Port Glasgow, or to be unloaded completely onto carts and taken up to Glasgow by road. That was until 1773, when the brilliant 18th century engineer John Goulburn constructed an 800-yard training wall to scour out a deeper channel in the River Clyde, and it did this by constricting water flow to one area of the river, which made it flow faster and of course scour out the bottom naturally. This was, and still is, known as the Lang Dyke, and dyke is a Scots word for a wall. Also, over 100 jetties were constructed to restrict the flow of the river, which increased its flow, thus deepening it even further. And it worked, increasingly allowing larger vessels to go upriver straight into the centre of Glasgow. And remnants of the Lang Dyke or the wall remain today and is visible at low tide. Well, with accessibility upriver came an explosion of shipbuilding capacity, and Clyde Shipbuilding was born. As I mentioned earlier, there were about 200 shipbuilding firms connected in some way with the Clyde, of which 30 or 40 would be operating at any one time. So let's have a look at some of those yards and their achievements, and I'm going to start at the entry to the River Clyde, or the Clyde estuary, where it all began, in the town of Greenock. This is effectively where the River Clyde ends, with Glasgow about 24 miles upriver. And I start here because this is where the modern era of shipbuilding commenced on the River Clyde. The town's name Greenock is believed to have come from the legend of a green oak tree at the edge of the River Clyde being used by local fishermen to tie up their boats. Now, although this is folklore and has been handed down through the centuries as the source of the name, the image of an oak tree on Greenock's history has remained. The green oak has frequently been used as an emblem or logo, carved on public buildings. It's been used on banners and badges throughout the town. And in 1992, the Oak Mall opened at the town's new shopping centre and even used a green tree as its logo. On the Greenock coat of arms, although no oak tree, there are clear references to shipbuilding and the fishing industry, which thrived here for over 200 years. The building of the first pier and harbour in Greenock in the 17th century helped bolster the shipbuilding industry in the town, which was already a well-established and important employer by this time. The first modern shipbuilders, Scots Shipbuilding and Engineering Company in Greenock, was established in 1711 and was the oldest shipbuilding business in the world. The family subsequently bought the adjacent yard of R. Steel & Company in 1883 to create the Cartsburn Dockyard, which was laid out for naval shipbuilding. There were other takeovers, and in 1967 the company merged with Lithgow's to form Scott Lithgow Limited. Notable vessels built included the early Royal Mail steam packet company liners Clyde, Dee, Solway and Tweed in 1841. They also built warships, and the British S-class submarine in 1914, one of them, HMS Seraph, was used in the Operation Mincemeat during the Second World War, an incredibly daring operation which would save thousands of lives. Let me tell you about it. Operation Mincemeat was a successful British deception operation of the Second World War to disguise the 1943 Allied invasion of Sicily. The body of Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man who died from eating rat poison, was dressed as a Royal Marine officer who had the identity on him as the fictitious Captain William Martin Royal Marines. Fictitious correspondence between two British generals that suggested that the Allies planned to invade Greece and Sardinia and not Sicily was also placed on the body. With the approval of Winston Churchill and the military commander in the Mediterranean, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the plan began by transporting the body of Michael to the southern coast of Spain by the submarine HMS Seraph and releasing it close to the shore, where it was picked up the following morning by a Spanish fisherman. The nominally neutral Spanish government shared copies of the documents with the Abwehr, the German military intelligence organization, before returning the body to the British. And it was quite clear from forensic examination, it showed that the documents had been read and decryption of German messages showed the Germans fell for the ruse. German reinforcements were shifted to Greece and Sardinia from Sicily, and when Allied forces did eventually invade Sicily, it was liberated much more quickly than anticipated, and Allied losses were much lower than predicted. And it was a Clyde-built submarine, HMS Seraph, that made this possible. Of course, this story was covered in the epic film The Man Who Never Was, a very old film now, but it's a great film to watch if you haven't seen it. Sorry for the slight digression, but I always find it fascinating to know what happens to ships once they eventually sail from the yard in which they were built. Effectively, what became of them? How long did they sail the high seas? What adventures did they have? Well, there's one or two other ships that I'll mention in the podcast coming up with even greater adventures. Just to finish off with Scott Lithgow Shipbuilders, their principal customers were the Blue Funnel Line, for which they built 88 ships, and the China Navigation Company, 95 ships, as well as 114 ships for the Royal Navy, and all from an idea that the original Scott family had in 1711. Of course, as we'll see, much of the success of the Clyde shipbuilding era was because of the advent and improvement of the steam engine, which marked massive opportunities for Glasgow to expand its heavy industry and for that steam power to be used in Clyde-built ships. This technology also led the world in propulsion innovation. And the person that improved the early steam engine to power those ships was James Watt. It's to one of Greenock's own sons, James Watt, that we owe so much. The famous James Watt, born in Greenock in 1736, he was a Scottish inventor, mechanical engineer, and a chemist who improved on Thomas Newcomen's steam engine with his Watt steam engine in 1776. And these improvements were fundamental to the enormous changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution in both his native Great Britain and the rest of the world. Effectively, while Watt was working as an instrument maker at the University of Glasgow, he became interested in the technology of steam engines. He realised that contemporary engine designs wasted a great deal of energy by repeatedly cooling and reheating the cylinder. Watt introduced a design enhancement, the separate condenser, which avoided this waste of energy and radically improved the power, efficiency and cost-effectiveness of steam engines. Eventually, he adapted his engine to produce rotary motion, greatly broadening its use beyond pumping water. As an aside, it was James Watt who coined the phrase horsepower. Watt determined that a horse could perform a certain amount of work, specifically lifting 550 pounds, 1 foot in 1 second, which he rounded up to 33,000 foot-pounds of work per minute, and this became standard definition of 1 horsepower. So there we have it, James Watt, a fantastic engineer and the man who invented horsepower. Well, let's move on from Scott's yard at Greenock and move about 3 miles along the coast to the next area of shipbuilding, and we come to Port Glasgo. And if you stand today in the centre of Port Glasgo, you would have been standing in the original fishing hamlet named Newark, after the 15th century castle of the same name, and indeed the ruin of Newark Castle can still be seen right next to Ferguson's shipbuilding yard. Port Glasgo came about as a result of large ships being unable to navigate the shallow and meandering River Clyde to the centre of the city of Glasgow, and as a result Newark was renamed as New Port Glasgo, as a remote port for the city in 1668, where ships would unload their cargo and have it taken overland by carts. Port Glasgo was also home to dry docks, and shipbuilding began in 1762, 50 years after Greenock. And through that century the town became known simply as Port Glasgo. Ships mostly owned by Glasgow merchants imported tobacco, sugar, rum, cotton, mahogany from the Americas, as well as timber, iron and hemp from the Baltic. The ruin of Newark Castle still stands on the banks of the River Clyde, adjacent to the only remaining shipyard in Port Glasgo. It was in 1780 Thomas McGill set up one of the first shipyards in the area, right next to Newark Castle, and by the 19th century, Port Glasgo had become a centre of shipbuilding. The first commercial paddle steamer, the P.S. Comet, was built in 1812 for Henry Bell, hotels and baths owner in Helensburgh, and that's where I used to live, which can be seen across the Clyde estuary from Port Glasgo. This was the first commercially successful steamboat service in Europe and plied its trade between Glasgow and Greenock. A full-size working replica of the Comet was built in 1962 to mark its 150th anniversary. This replica used to sit in Port Glasgo town centre, but since 2023, due to deterioration of the structure, It's been removed and I'm not sure where it is at present. I know there was much talk of preserving the Comet, but the costs of repair were such that no plans have been shared with the public to see if it's going to return in the near future. Over many years, Port Glasgo became the home of a shipbuilding dynasty and was responsible for about a quarter of the total tonnage of ships launched on the Clyde. However, as with most of Inverclyde's industry, the shipbuilding industry has all but gone, and only Ferguson Marine Engineering remains in the town today. It too has fallen on hard times and has gone through a rather controversial and somewhat scandalous nationalisation, with the latest ferries built 4 years behind schedule and 3 times the cost. But it survives for now, and it will be interesting to see how it moves forward. And as for the ferry building debacle, no heads have rolled and none will, it would appear. But if you want a good read on how not to build ships to time and budget, then Google Port Glasgo, Ferguson Shipbuilders, Ferry Scandal. It is an interesting read. Well, by the mid-1800s, the River Clyde up to Glasgow was sufficiently deepened and new road and rail links meant that Port Glasgo was no longer needed as a port for transferring goods, so the shipbuilding industry took over as the main source of employment and prosperity. And as we move upriver to the next major shipbuilding yard at Denny's of Dumbarton, just across the water, it's worth noting a phenomenon that confuses many motorists as they pass this way. There are a large number of wooden poles sticking out of the water between Port Glasgo and Lang Bank. These are actually old timber ponds. During the 18th and early 19th century, the shipbuilding industry required vast quantities of thoroughly seasoned timber, and with shipyards occupying most of the shoreline from central Greenock to eastern Port Glasgo, demand was huge. The timber was imported from North America, Canada and Norway, and amounted to some 28,000 tonnes by 1834. The timber was unloaded at the mid-harbour point, then chained together with rafters and floated to the ponds. And at their peak, the ponds extended to the Gare Loch on the opposite side of the Clyde from Greenock and Port Glasgo. But the arrival of pre-cut timber and then the introduction of steel construction by 1914 meant that few of the timber ponds remained in use. The ponds simply prevented the timber from floating away and allowed the logs to be organised according to type, length and seasoning, and ownership, of course. Remnants of the timber ponds are these lines of vertical wooden posts sticking out of the mud, and rectangular collection areas can still be seen here. Well, as we leave Port Glasgo and make our way along the riverbank towards Glasgow, on the left-hand side, across the other side of the River Clyde, the towering figure of Dumbarton Castle, sitting on the volcanic plug, looms into view. Right next to it is the site of Denny's Shipbuilding Yard of Dumbarton, which sat at the confluence of the River Leven and the River Clyde, and this is where the Denny's shipyard was established in the late 18th century, and it's just below the famous Dumbarton Castle, or Alt Clwyd, as I mentioned before. Over 1,500 ships were built here between 1844 and its closure in 1963. But Denny's wasn't just a shipbuilder, it was an innovator and a pioneering company. This building yard was also involved in building the first steamship that crossed the Channel in 1814, the first turbine steamer 1901, and the first diesel-electric paddle ship 1934, to name but a few. Also well known from Dumbarton was the fast clipper Cutty Sark, currently a visitor attraction in London. And if you looked at old photos, you would see the shipbuilding yard dominating the whole area, but today, after a considerable transformation, you will now find a housing estate and a football stadium. One particular ship built here in 1899 and still operating on Loch Katrine today in the Trossachs is the SS Sir Walter Scott, which is a much-loved tourist attraction. Now, Loch Katrine is the loch made famous by the author Sir Walter Scott in his poem Lady of the Lake. The steamship that takes his name now sits at the Trossachs Pier. It's now a veteran steamship and was built at the Denny's yard, then taken to pieces like a jigsaw and delivered by horse and cart to Loch Katrine Pier and rebuilt. Incredible. But Denny's wasn't just a shipbuilder, they were pioneers. And if you visit the Denny Ship Model Experiment Tank in Dumbarton, which is now a visitor attraction, you will see the world's first commercial example of a ship testing tank, opened in 1883. It was used to test models of various ships' hulls and looked at different propulsion methods, including propellers, paddles and vane wheels. Experiments were carried out on ship stabilizers and also hovercraft to gauge their feasibility. This was indeed extraordinary innovation and forward thinking that paved the way for future seagoing vessels around the world. And to give you an idea of that innovation, in 1878, Denny's was responsible for building the Mahana, the first all-steel merchant ship. In 1901, the SS King Edward was the world's first commercial turbine steamer. In 1934, the Robert the Bruce, a car ferry on the Firth of Forth, was the first all-welded vessel, as well as the first diesel-electric paddle ship. One ship in particular that was built that interested me was a Royal Naval warship with the pennant number F-37. It was built in 1957 and named HMS Jaguar, a Leopard-class frigate, and, as it happened, this was the last frigate built by Denny's. When I completed my Royal Naval officer training, HMS Jaguar was on the list of ships that I could have been sent to. As it happens, I went on to serve in HMS Gurkha as a midshipman, a tribal-class frigate, and yet both Leopard and Gurkha occasionally exercised together. A few tales to tell there, I can assure you, but that is for another day. On leaving Dumbarton, we continue upriver towards Glasgow, and after about 8.5 miles, we arrive at one of the most famous yards, John Brown and Company of Clyde Bank. It's probably one of the best known names in the world of shipbuilding. Interestingly enough, the yard was started by J&G Thomson, who had established a reputation in building prestigious passenger ships, particularly for the Cunard Line in the mid-1800s. And for my American friends, you'll be interested to know that several of the ships they built were purchased by the Confederacy during the American Civil War. Now, for non-Americans, the Confederacy in the South was led by Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, while the Unionists in the North were led by Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. The central conflict, and I won't go into detail, but it was about slavery, and the Unionists who opposed slavery were ultimate victors in 1865. To show you the reach of both sides, the Confederates bought weapons and equipment from abroad, including the Robert E. Lee, built by John Brown shipbuilders. It was a fast paddle steamer and used as a blockade runner, and very successfully until captured by the Union in 1863. Another ship bought by the Confederacy was the Fingal, which was converted into the ironclad Atlanta, again used as a blockade runner. Coming back to the steelmaker John Brown and Company, they bought out J&G Thomson, and that's when the real shipbuilding of this company began. Now, John Brown was born in Sheffield in 1816, the son of a house builder, and was a self-made man, making an absolute fortune from steel conical spring buffers for railway carriages. Having bought his own steel company, he started selling rails to railway companies. Almost sounds like Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate. By 1867, his iron cladding was being used on the majority of Royal Navy warships, and in the early 1900s, his innovative marine engineering technology impressed the Admiralty, commencing a relationship with the Royal Navy and the building of many warships. The first notable order was for the battlecruiser HMS Inflexible, followed by the battlecruisers Her Majesty's Australian ship Australia and Her Majesty's ship Tiger, and the battleship HMS Barham. When the First World War broke out in 1914, John Brown's was well prepared for the considerable orders coming from the Admiralty, and by the end of the war it had built more destroyers than any other British shipyard, and also set records for their speed of shipbuilding. HMS Simoon, for example, took only 7 months from keel laying to departure, an incredible feat, and that does make me smile when I think it took the modern-day Fergus's Yard 7 years to build a ferry. Anyway, moving on. One very famous merchant ship, if not infamous ship, that was built was the Royal Mail ship, or the RMS Lusitania, and she was laid down in 1904, just before the First World War. She was launched on 7th of June 1906 and was the largest ship of its day. Prior to her construction, the shipyard was reorganised to accommodate her so that she could be launched diagonally across the widest available part of the River Clyde, where it met the tributary. The ship was actually 786 feet long, where the river was only 610 feet wide. The new slipway took up the space of 2 existing ones and was built on reinforcing piles driven deeply into the ground to ensure it could take the temporary concentrated weight of the whole ship as it slid diagonally into the water. Lusitania was actually launched on the 7th of June 1906, and she was the largest ship of its day. It held the Blue Riband Award for the fastest Atlantic crossing and the world's largest passenger ship. However, a terrible event. On the afternoon of the 7th of May 1915, 1 year into the First World War, changed the course of history. The Lusitania was 11 miles south of the coast of Ireland on a return trip from New York when, Without warning, she was struck by 2 torpedoes from the German U-boat U-20. On board were 1,900 people, 1,200 of whom were passengers. The unexpectedness of the attack left the crew little or no time to launch the lifeboats, and only 6 of the 48 lifeboats were actually launched successfully. The ship sank below the waves in 18 minutes, with a total loss of almost 1,200 lives, with many prominent figures of the day among them. The result of this tragic sinking of the Lusitania turned public opinion in many countries against Germany, and was probably the major contribution to the United States' entry into the First World War. Another rather sad tale involves a warship this time, built in the Second World War. This was the famous battleship HMS Hood. In 1941, she was sent to intercept the German battleship Bismarck. During the battle, Hood was struck by several shells, and one entered her magazine, causing an explosion that tore the ship apart. It literally sank within minutes, with the loss of over 1,300 lives and only 3 survivors. A very sad day for the United Kingdom, a terrible tragedy for the Royal Navy. After the war, John Brown and Company continued to build many other notable and world-famous ships, including the Queen Mary, the very first Queen Elizabeth, and also Queen Elizabeth II, or as it's better known, QE2. The wonderfully luxurious QE2 was retired from active service in 2008 and sold to Dubai for a conversion, and what a conversion it is. It's now permanently docked in Dubai, which is the United Arab Emirates, where it's been converted into a luxury floating hotel and a museum located in the Port Rashid terminal. And just to complete the story of John Brown's yard, during the post-war period, it continued to thrive, and many more ships were built, but by the 1960s, like so many yards on the River Clyde, Brown's was no longer economically viable and was threatened with closure. It briefly became part of the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, but sadly closed its doors in 1971. The original site where the yard was situated was a sprawling mass of industrialisation with docks, workshops and material for building ships. If you flew overhead today, it would be difficult to believe that this was once a thriving shipbuilding yard, and instead it's now a comprehensively regenerated area. A new campus for Clydebank College was opened in August 2008. Regeneration meant improved infrastructure, modern offices, a light industrial estate and new housing, retail and leisure facilities. It was hoped that as part of the plan, QE2 would be returned to the city and river where she was built, but as I've already said, she was sold to Dubai as a floating hotel. And before I leave Clydebank, I just want to mention something that I'm often asked about by American clients in particular. Was Scotland particularly bombed during the war, especially the Second World War? Well, during the Second World War, Glasgow became a prime target for the German Luftwaffe due to its shipbuilding effort in repairing many battleships. And as a result of raids by German bombers on the nights of the 13th and 14th of March 1941, Clydebank was largely destroyed, with a loss of over 1,200 people and many more injured. Out of approximately 12,000 houses, only 8 remained undamaged. The German attempt to break the spirit of the Clydesiders, however, failed, and this attack increased the resolve of the Clyde shipbuilding industry and Scotland at large to continue the fight. Moving a further 3 miles up the River Clyde towards Glasgow, we arrive at Scotstoun, another site of a very famous shipbuilding empire. It was in 1861 Charles Connell and Company had opened their first purpose-built shipyard at Scotstoun, and they initially concentrated on wooden sailing ships and clippers for private owners and merchants, bringing exotic goods to the British Isles, including fruits, teas and a whole variety of spices imported from the West Indies and from southern Asia. They were good at what they did, and this was noticed by a man called Alfred Yarrow of Yarrow Shipbuilders in London, who, as it happens, were running out of space in a crowded River Thames. Yarrow Shipbuilders had themselves been in existence since 1865 and had been building steam launches, lake and river vessels for use around the world. The business expanded rapidly, and founder Alfred Yarrow was obviously a man of some foresight when he solved their ever-growing need for space in one strikingly bold move. They bought the Scotstoun Yard and relocated to the Clyde. Apart from increasing the space they needed to expand, there were also good arguments for moving closer to a source of readily available raw materials, the coal, the steel, There was also a ready supply of experienced labour to operate the enormous presses and foundries needed in steel-built vessels of all kinds. 2 acres of riverside land were bought at just £50 per acre, half the price per acre in London, and in an extraordinary move between 4,000 and 5,000 tonnes of material, machinery and equipment were moved via daily train loads of between 40 to 50 wagons at a time. The whole project was achieved in under 5 weeks. Such was the planning, skills and eagerness of the company management. When Alfred Yarrow moved his shipyard from the Isle of Dogs on the River Thames in London to Scotstoun on the Clyde in 1906, he took with him 300 of his own workers. The workers were, for some reason, unhappy with the new Scottish tenement buildings, which are multi-occupancy apartments. So, to satisfy his workforce, Yarrow commissioned 40 individual brick houses to be built, and these were aptly named Yarrow Cottages. They were innovative at the time and were built with gardens, and if you get a chance to visit the old Scotstoun yard, then go behind the shipyard buildings by the river, where you'll find this ready-built estate for the workers. Ingenious. As the First World War began, Scotstoun enjoyed an advantage in that it had already been manufacturing ships for the military, and it was able to begin mass production. At its peak, the yard employed over 2,000 workers, and during the conflict had produced 29 destroyers, 16 gunboats, a submarine, 3 hospital ships, as well as a floating workshop for the Royal Navy. During the Second World War, Scotstoun was revitalised and built 18 J-class destroyers, such as HMS Jupiter. They also built 8 sloops and 2 river gunboats, and during the conflict, sadly the yard was bombed and badly damaged, and 47 shipyard workers were also killed. After the war in 1945, the yard returned to making merchant ships, and for the next 10 years it was an extremely busy shipbuilding facility, making shallow draft vessels for countries all around the world. Often these were shipped out in sections for reassembly at their destination. In 1968, Yarrow and the Scotstoun Yard briefly became part of a consortium called Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, which was formed from the amalgamation of 5 Upper Clyde shipbuilding firms: Fairfield and Govan, Alexander Stephen and Linthouse, Charles Connell and Company in Scotstoun, John Brown and Company at Clydebank, and Yarrow Shipbuilders Limited. The project was not a success, however, and Yarrow Shipbuilders left the consortium. 4 years later, Yarrow made a further acquisition of the Barclay Curl or Elderslie dockyard, which lay to the west of Scotstoun Yard and which included 3 large dry docks. This investment, coupled with a strong manufacturing reputation, meant Yarrow and Scotstoun would become one of 4 major contractors for the Royal Navy. Well, after a further 40 years of failed nationalisation and reprivatisation, a merger between British Aerospace and Marconi Electrical Systems formed BAE Systems Marine, and in 2009 Scotstoun was renamed as BAE Systems Surface Ships. In its time, Scotstoun has seen over 370 vessels built on the banks of the Clyde and is immersed in a history of innovation, design and a high standard of marine engineering which is envied the world over. Today, the yard is currently heavily involved in the new Type 26 City Class programme with its neighbour BAE Systems across the water at Govan. And if you stand on the Scotstoun side and look over to BAE Systems, you might be lucky enough to get a glimpse of one of the new destroyers being built in the massive construction sheds. The site which BAE Systems now occupies is the old Fairfield shipbuilding yard of Govan, and Fairfield remains a name well known throughout the shipbuilding world. If you had been standing on the site in the late 1700s, you would have been standing on a farm called Fairfield, and the name was adopted by its buyers. It was Charles Randolph who founded the company as Randolph and Company, and he had been an apprentice at the Clyde shipyard of Robert Napier, mentor to so many of the great shipbuilders. The company originally specialised in building ship engines in the early 1800s, but moved into shipbuilding in 1860 at the old Govan shipyard just along from the Fairfield site. In 1870 to 1871, it built 2 steamers for the London to Aberdeen line, the City of London and Ban Rye, which were about 20% faster than their predecessors, while their fuel consumption was less than half. The reputation of Fairfields was further boosted when it became a major warship builder, turning out many vessels for the Royal Navy during the First and the Second World War. It also built many transatlantic liners, including the record-breaking ships for the Cunard Line and Canadian Pacific, such as the blue ribbon-winning sisters RMS Campania and RMS Lusania. At the other end of the scale, Fairfields built fast cross-channel mail steamers and ferries for locations around the world, and these included ships for the Bosphorus crossing in Istanbul and some of the early ships used by the holiday destination company Thomas Cook for developing tourism on the River Nile. One of the first Bosphorus ferries was the Water Witch. It had a fascinating life and saw action at Gallipoli as a troop carrier. One of the older Fairfield-built Bosphorus ferries is still in operation and now serves as a luxury cruise ship in the Mediterranean. I'm delighted to say that the entrance to the old shipyard is still in place, with its imposing red sandstone offices of the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company on Govan Road, which from 2013 has formed the Fairfield Heritage Centre. The shipyard's drawing offices were designed by John Keppie of Honeyman and Keppie, with help from a young Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who you will have heard of course, because he was one of our most famous architects of the 19th century. If you stand in front of the imposing old Fairfield entrance, you will notice two sculpted figures, the engineer and the shipwright, on either side of the door, indicating the trades that were employed here. In the 1950s, the yard underwent a major modernisation programme, which was implemented slowly over a period of 10 years. To minimise disruption to the yard, Fairfields was formed into Govan Shipbuilders in 1972, which was itself later nationalised and subsumed into British Shipbuilders in 1977. On the break-up of British Shipbuilders under denationalisation in 1988, the former Fairfield yard was sold to the Norwegian Kvaerner Group and renamed Kvaerner Govan. The yard passed to BAE Systems in 1999 and is now part of BAE Surface Ships. I know it's not easy to follow, but this is what's happened over the last few years in the shipbuilding industry in Britain today. Well, today BAE Systems Maritime is the largest shipbuilding company in the United Kingdom, one of the largest shipbuilders in Europe and one of the world's largest builders of complex warships. And it's going strong, with a recent order announced from the Norwegian government for 4 new anti-submarine frigates to join NATO forces operating in the North Sea to monitor Russian expansion into that area. Well, Govan is as far as the shipyards were built on the River Clyde and only 10 minutes from the centre of the city. So you can see how connected ships and shipbuilding were to the city and its financial fortunes. This is the end of our overview or snapshot on shipbuilding on the Clyde, and it's difficult to do justice to the impact that this activity had on the city. At the beginning of the podcast, I told you about the yards that operated up and down the Clyde, explaining that between 1711, when the Scott family shipyard was built at Greenock, and the present day, over 25,000 ships have been built on the river. It's estimated that more than 200 firms have engaged in shipbuilding on Clyde's side, with 30 to 40 firms operating at any given time. Glasgow, because of its trade in shipbuilding, was named the second city of the empire in Victorian times, and in the period from 1750 to 1950 was one of the most important shipbuilding cities in the world. Today there are only 3 yards left, but what we lack in numbers, we more than make up in technology and the advanced ships that were built today. So what's left? Well, if you drive down the River Clyde and walk past some of the old shipyards, you will see many old derelict docks reminding us of a time when Clyde was the world's predominant shipbuilding river. The demise of shipbuilding on the Clyde when it came was swift. By the end of the 1950s, shipbuilding in other European nations, and in Korea and Japan in particular, was newly recapitalised and become highly productive by using new methods such as modular design. Many British yards had continued to use outmoded working practices and largely obsolete equipment, making themselves uncompetitive. A man who witnessed this demise was the father of a good friend of mine, Andy Scott. Bill Scott, who worked in Clyde Shipbuilding for over 40 years, agreed to be interviewed a couple of years ago for a video that I did on Clyde Shipbuilding, and although Bill's no longer with us, I'm able to bring his voice back to life in this podcast.
Well, can I say a very warm welcome to Bill Scott, OBE, who has worked in the shipbuilding industry and the engineering industry for quite a few years, from 1958 to 2002, 44 years service on the River Clyde, effectively. Bill started at Fairfields, that we mentioned earlier, and really ended his career at Ferguson's yacht, which is just up from here. And so thank you, Bill, for coming along. I'd like to ask just a couple of questions, if that's all right.
Surely.
Well, Bill, you've got quite an impressive resume. Can you give us an impression of what it was like to work here when you joined the industry at the age of 16 back in 1958?
Well, the Clyde was preeminent in world shipping in the 50s. Latterly it was starting to go down, but not at the rate it did after 1958. Employment in the Clyde was direct employment, 45,000 people in total, depending on the yards, was reckoned to be in the order of 200,000 people.
That's huge. I mean, we often have a feeling that the decline started much earlier, but you're saying even in the late 50s, early 60s, we're still a huge employer and still prominent in the world as a shipbuilder.
Indeed, yeah, very much so. At that time, they were still recruiting something in the region of 400 to 600 apprentices every year.
I mean, how many shipyards were still operating at that time?
Oh, 6 on the upper reaches. In total, 22 yards and 10 slow-speed engine builders.
I mean, that's quite incredible, even at that stage, to have that size of shipbuilding capacity. Can you give us a feel for what it was like going from that in the early 60s to what we find today? What was the transition? What made it?
Transition was very fast. The impact of Japanese shipbuilding and low-cost, cheap ships, very similar to what they did with the car industry and the motorbike industry. They set their sights on these employers of large numbers of people, and they went and pursued it with a 15, 20-year policy that didn't change. And the consequence was we then had Korea coming in, and latterly China.
Yeah. And can you give us an impression as when did you really feel the crunch coming? Because you worked in the industry so long.
Yeah.
You started at the beginning with so many shipyards and so many people. When did you get this feeling? So what year and what were you doing at the time?
Really, in the early 70s, it was clear that it was not part of the national policy to pursue shipbuilding, as it did with many heavy industries at that time. Whereas you were getting other countries supporting the industries, such as shipbuilding. And there was pressure. I was working in British Shipbuilders headquarters at that time, running the engineering division. And it was a fight every year to stop closures.
Well, Bill, with just 3 yards left now on the Clyde, what do you see as the future for the River Clyde in Glasgow in shipbuilding terms?
Very, very difficult. Even BAE Systems in Glasgow are only producing parts of ships to then be shipped and constructed, final construction elsewhere, as we saw with the 2 aircraft carriers at Rosyth. There is an over-dependency on defence contracts, and that's something that's very difficult to overcome. The merchant ship and development of merchant ships now is, we've lost a lot of the skills. I spoke to someone a couple of years ago on the Tyne where I'd worked in ship repair, and I was saying, how's things down there? And he was saying, oh, it's awful. I can't get a marine plumber. I can get as many naval architects as you want, but I can't get marine plumbers. And those skills have been lost now. And we're lost up here.
And no chance of them coming back?
I don't think so. I don't think anyone would invest the capital in order to resurrect any of these industries.
Now, I know you were heavily involved in Ferguson's towards the end of your career. You can see what's happening at the moment with these 2 ships sadly delayed and well over budget. I mean, is Ferguson's a viable proposition? Should that be closing and leaving only 2 shipbuilding yards?
There's been a huge investment in the place since I left it. I mean, we were fighting to get support to keep it going at that time, although we were profitable. Personally, I didn't want to sell. It was my colleagues who wanted to sell. But there's certain areas of specialised building that I think Ferguson's could contribute to. But it's got to be specialised products, and products which we can add to the requirements of the customer in terms of developing the ships.
Yes, it's fascinating to hear you say perhaps what Ferguson could be doing in the future. I suppose if you look back in Victorian times, Glasgow was the second city of the empire. And of course, this was probably one of the most important places, the Clyde, for building ships. What do you think, what's your personal opinion of the lasting legacy of Clyde shipbuilding?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I mean, we're standing and behind us with the sugar storehouses of all the trade that came into this river. That's been lost. The tobacco trade's been lost. That was really the legacy that built the Clyde in terms of shipbuilding, and much of that has now gone away. Very, very difficult to see where it goes from now, but there is much to be proud of in what we have achieved in the past, and we shouldn't let that slip.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate you coming along today and chatting to us for our virtual tour of Glasgow Shipbuilding on the Clyde. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill, and I'm so grateful to have been able to interview such an important figure in shipbuilding for the past 50 years. Now, I've talked a lot of the demise of Glasgow's shipbuilding era and how Glasgow itself suffered when the last few yards closed due to the competition from the Far East in particular. Well, I'm pleased to report that not all is gloom and doom on the Clyde today. Like a phoenix from the ashes, Glasgow and the Clyde are rising to make this city and its river an exciting and important destination for people from all over the world. And as for the Clyde, a huge regeneration is underway. The Clyde Waterfront Regeneration Project is expected to attract investment of up to £5.6 billion in the area from Glasgow Green to Dumbarton. Market gardens and garden centres have sprung up on the fertile plains of the Clyde Valley. Tourism has also brought many people back to the riverside, especially in Glasgow, where former docklands have given way to housing and amenities on the banks of the river. Examples include the Glasgow Harbour Project, the Glasgow Science Centre and the Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre. The commercial port of Glasgow has been moved downriver to take advantage of the deeper waters of the Firth of Clyde, effectively returning the commercial site to where it all began. A dramatic rise and a dramatic fall. It was an incredible journey that took Glasgow and the Clyde from a small religious community to the epicentre of world shipbuilding. The phrase Clyde built was the compliment paid to ships built here on the River Clyde, and it had a meaning that was understood around the world. Production of the biggest and the best, the most advanced, and renowned for reliability. What next for Glasgow and the Clyde? Only time will tell. Well, during this year of Glasgow 850, I hope you've enjoyed this wee panoramic tour of central Glasgow. It's an amazing city with so much to offer. Glasgow is so different to Edinburgh, but I hope this podcast will whet your appetite to go and visit. As always, I've thoroughly enjoyed bringing a part of Scotland to you, and I always welcome feedback, so if you wish to comment on any of the areas we have visited today, or if you wish me to cover any aspect of Scottish life, then please do get in touch through the contact page on my website, or send an email to john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm also very pleased to have heard from many of you who have listened to the podcast. It's always great to meet some of you personally. Keep your messages of support coming, and don't forget, if you do intend visiting Scotland and want the best experience with a guide, then get in touch to discuss the possibility of a tour with me or indeed one of my colleagues. I go anywhere in Scotland and I feel like I know it like the back of my hand. Whether it's tourist spots, Scottish history, family connections, whisky, golf, I could go on, but soaking up this wonderful country from the back of a luxury Mercedes, taking you where you want to go, when you want to go, will be a lifetime gift to yourself, your family and friends. And if you don't wish a formal guide, then perhaps one of my bespoke itineraries may help you plan a more spectacular holiday. Once again, get in touch through my website, Exclusive Scottish Visits, or email me directly to get details of those specific itineraries. And if you've followed any of my tour routes, then do send a photograph of you on part of your trip with your name, and I'll get it up on my social media site. And thank you so much to those of you who have bought me a coffee, and if you wish to contribute in a very small way to these podcasts, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. All contributions are much appreciated, and please do share these Unique Scotland podcasts with friends and family. Next time, I'm going to talk to you about the Scottish clan system, and I'll home in on some of the more prominent clans such as the Campbells, Mackenzies, MacDonalds and MacLeods, as well as mention my own clan, of course, the Mackays. Something to look forward to. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you all listening today, and I would now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising my glass with a wee dram to you, wherever you are in the world. Slán Java.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.